This week, Koom interviews comics legend Denny O'Neil at Toronto Comicon. His career, his collaborators, his politics, his underwear. He also talks to comics creator and animator Sam Agro about what attracted him to animation, the evolution of comics conventions, and much more. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for keeping this show going. Join them at patreon.com/deconcomics. With our new tiers, you can now hear full-length extra content for only $4 a month. Details later in the show. If Patreon isn't in your budget, you can also send a one-time donation of any amount via PayPal to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
Man know what you do for a living. No, my garbage man does not.
Well, most garbage men don't care. Most comic book creators, children don't care. So...
Yeah, I mean, my wife used to teach 8th grade, so she was a big hero to her students because she gave away comic books as spelling prizes.
Right. So, speaking of which, how long have you been in the business for?
Rounding it off, 50 years, give or take.
Okay. Did you start working with DC or like a smaller
No,
company?
I was a journalist, just like you. I worked for a little newspaper in southeast Missouri. And Roy Thomas' parents subscribed to the paper, so he got in touch with me. I hung out with him.
His parents told him to get in touch with you?
No, his parents subscribed to the paper, which is how he saw the articles I wrote about the revival of comics.
Gotcha.
And then he...
Was he editing at Marvel at this time?
No, he was teaching high school at Fox High School in Missouri. And editing Alter Ego, which was, I think, by a wide margin, the best fanzine. So we hung out with him, and then he went to New York to work for the Superman editor. That lasted 2 weeks. I will not say anything about the Superman editor.
Are you talking about Julie Schwartz?
No, Julie was the most underrated man in publishing. Then he got hired by Stan. Marvel was just beginning to explode. And Stan had been doing everything for years and years. Writing the stories, writing the cover copy, designing the cover copy, copy editing the art, the text pages, everything. And suddenly, Marvel was a happening event, so he hired first Steve Skates, and then I think Roy was next, and I came after Roy, and a guy named Ron White, bravest man I've ever known.
So are you saying you started Marvel then?
Yeah, I worked as an editorial assistant on staff for about 6 months. And then I wrote a book on presidential elections, and I did some journalism. But I kept coming back to comics. I obviously had an aptitude for it. I mean, I passed this test, which was 4 pages of art without copy. Well, I mean, who wouldn't do that? Somebody hands you that, and instead of doing a crossword puzzle, you do that. And it got me the job. But I didn't know how long it was going to last, and it didn't last very long. I got fired after about 3 months. I had a 3-month-old infant, a non-working wife, and it was in the middle of a newspaper strike.
Just before we leave Marvel, I've got to ask, because I'm always curious about Marvel at that time. Did you have a good experience, a bad experience, a mixed experience?
It was a job. I mean, I thought I was doing great. I came in one morning and Stan fired me. He never said why, and Roy didn't know either. And years later, I wrote a book on how to write comics, and about 4 paragraphs were just about Stan, so I sent him. for fact-checking, being a responsible journalist. And he was very complimentary to me and said, we should never have let Denny go. And let me go. I had no money, no job, living in a rat-infested slum. And so I got lucky after that. A guy who had played guitar at my wedding was also a freelance science writer, and he knew of a few magazine jobs, one or two of which were pretty good. And then I wrote the book on presidential elections. Oh, too bad I'm not writing that now. Mm-hmm. And then I found a kind of life as a freelance writer. We lived very cheaply. We know what it's like to be poor, but things got gradually better. And at the end, it was the best job in the world. I first said that a year ago here in Canada, in Guelph. And then I said that in front of a TV camera and realized I believe this. I mean, I have traveled all over the world. I have lectured at the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress. I've had lunch at the Senate dining room. I have been to places that never occurred to me. I wouldn't have gone to Chile. It would never have occurred to me to do that. And Australia, wow. I worked with very smart, funny people. And at the end, the money got to be pretty good when we started getting paid for ancillary use of our characters. I got a $95,000 check, and I called the guy I knew and who was in charge of that stuff and said, I would really love to keep this money, Paul, but I didn't do anything to earn this. And he said, no, it's your money. We have used one of your characters in a video game.
Wow.
And the last...
This would have been the 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is Paul Levitz?
Yeah, Paul was the guy I got in touch with because that was the phone number I had. I mean, what I didn't realize was we had become respectable.
We're trying to fix the machine right now.
A senator from New England made contact with me and wanted to contribute something to the comics. And I thought, doesn't he know these are comic books? This is garbage. This is trash. This is ruining the children of the world. And no, he was proud to be associated with Batman.
Now, did you ever have any doubts about leaving journalism, and obviously a fairly political kind of journalism that you wrote, to...
Well, no, as a journalist, I mostly did boilerplate. I left journalism because I did the stupidest thing I have ever done, and I managed in 1 hour to alienate everybody in that town that I depended on. It was a very conservative town, still is. I did a show there 4 years ago. And this was in the height of the activism, the 60s, Flower Children. The underwear I'm wearing is tie-dye. Mary Fran made a couple of tie-dye underwear.
Is Mary Fran your wife?
She was. She died last November.
Oh, sorry. But that's hilarious.
Yeah.
He's still wearing her underwear. Not her underwear, but underwear she tie-dyed.
Yeah, I
that's love.
Yeah, I looked at it this morning and thought, yeah, I gotta. I'm leaving the country. I gotta wear this.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wrote a phony.
So I'm guessing you're not a Trump fan.
Oh, I don't know why anybody's a Trump fan.
No,
I am suffering from a disease that they have not figured out. I get dizzy about once a month. And nobody knows why. But the two ladies who are given the job of looking in on me 5 times a week are Trumpites. And it makes for some very careful conversations.
You don't want to jeopardize them harming you or anything like that.
Yeah, that's true. And on the other hand, they're wrong.
Yes.
And they're ignorant.
Yes, they are. They are.
Mean, when he was nobody other than a rich kid who got into the gossip columns, I thought, this guy's got to be the biggest jerk in the world.
Uh-huh.
And his campaign, he telegraphed everything he was going to do as president. His gun cause, took a big body blow yesterday when the parents of the kids who got slaughtered at that school in Connecticut got a federal judge to say they could sue the Remington Company for the manufacture of AK-47s that have no use except to kill human beings. So that's the first actual thing that's happened. And we've been having slaughters 2 or 3 times a month. It's
horrible.
Yeah.
There's no question. Yeah. And even up here, too, we've got too many hate crimes that are just...
Yeah, we did a comic book called... I forget what that comic book was. Anyway, one of our colleagues' sons going to the corner to use a phone because his apartment phone was broken, got shot to death. And that's been like 40 years now. The crime will never be solved. It was one of those 70s crimes when there's no reason for it. It wasn't robbery. But we did a comic book about the gun problem, and usually we make a sharp demarcation. Gotham City is not New York. Gotham City is, in my imagination, it's in New Jersey. But
why New Jersey, just out of curiosity?
Because if such a place was to exist, and in my world, there are 7 million people. It's not quite as big as New York. And there are all of those little resort towns that are strung along the New Jersey beach. If you consolidated all of them into one city, you would have Gotham City.
Got it.
I think you have to be careful of that stuff because I don't want to write continuity comics. A lot of my colleagues have what I think is not the right attitude. We are professionals. That is my first duty, whether I'm writing relevant stuff or not, is to entertain the person who bought the book. And if they buy a book and it's got on the cover a guy with a mask and a cape, they're not expecting the New Republic.
Well, now that you say that, that makes a lot of sense, because based on reading your Batman comics, I mean, I've read the Neil Adams stuff, and I really like the Daredevil run that you did with Matt Sekeli, but based on reading your comics, they do seem very... I don't know what the right word is. I want to say conservative, but I don't mean politically conservative. I just mean narratively conservative. But talking to you, you're a radical, interesting person.
I'm not.
You're bursting with commentary.
My first wife was a Catholic worker, and Catholic worker was started in 1939 by a wonderful woman named Dorothy Day. I got interviewed by the Catholic Church 2 weeks ago because Dorothy's going to be made a saint. And what she did was she opened this place on the Bowery. She fed the hungry, she clothed the naked, and she gave shelter to the homeless. And then she protested the wars big time. They had all of those required
criteria.
Drills. Dorothy would walk down Fifth Avenue in the center of the street during a drill. She got arrested more times than she could count. She was also my first mother-in-law's best friend. And that's a real radical. But
yeah, you're right. Maybe I overstepped using that word. But what I mean is, like, there were all these other writers who in the 80s were bringing all these weird tangents and directions into comics, but you were kind of sticking to the old model, I think.
Well, I don't ever read published material, but I had.
So you weren't reading your contemporary stuff?
I don't read it now. No, I found that's a good way to get depressed.
Sure.
But
so you weren't reading like Frank Miller's take on Batman? Or?
I was editing Frank Miller, and he has given me public credit for teaching him to write. Frank and I walked around Greenwich Village for hour after hour after hour talking about the work. I mean, writers, when they get together, usually talk about computer programs or whatever. Mm-hmm. Frank and I did a couple of stories together, and we talked it over almost panel by panel. I saw Frank 3 weeks ago in somewhere where I was working at Con, and he was very cordial and very nice.
Sure. He has a lot of respect for the generation before him, I find.
Yeah, but I found out what his politics were.
Oh, they're horrible now.
Yeah, when a guy
they're horrible.
who wrote a book on superheroes cited me at the left end of the spectrum and Frank at the right. I didn't know before I read that Frank had switched so drastically, but I read the thing he wrote about the kids who were picketing Wall Street, and I happened to be teaching across the street from Wall Street.
I know.
It was not only politically suspect, it was ugly and nasty.
I mean, I don't want to make this discussion about Miller, but Miller's changed so much, and his hijinks more, in his latter part of his life, because of the explosion of social media, have now gone back and tainted that amazing stuff from the 80s, where you're right, politically, he wasn't
I thought he was one of us sissy liberals.
Yeah, he was. He was. I think in the early 80s, when he and Lynn were, just artists trying to figure things out.
Yeah, I've rented Lynn's apartment. I subletted that during that period. Yeah.
Are you still living in New York?
No, I'm living in a town called Nyack. It's 25 miles straight up the Hudson. And I don't think I will live anywhere else. We moved there about 17 years ago. My son had worked on a movie in the town, and I was thinking maybe I knew I was going to quit my editorial job, and maybe I'll go back to St. Louis. I didn't know what I was doing. Well, my wife was teaching at Upper Nyack School. She had been teaching for 40 years at that point. She was the best teacher I have ever met.
What did she teach?
She taught first, second, and third grade. And the secret was she was super conscientious but lovable. You couldn't be in her company 5 minutes without adoring her. And she loved children. She was never happier than when she was surrounded by second graders. And we were childhood sweethearts who didn't see each other for 30 years. And when we got back together, I sent her some comic books, and she was the comic book reader in the family.
Wow!
So I thank God. I don't know that this relationship would have rekindled if she thought this is garbage, but I gave her a subscription to Mad for her 17th birthday, and she kept it up all those years. Until we started hanging out with the guy who edited Mad, really terrific guy named Nick.
But I guess what you're saying is you wrote comics, you edited comics, but you weren't really reading comics as a fan.
I was reading everything. I would go into DC's conference room, and they had a wall full of comic books.
Yeah.
And I would just look for stuff I thought was interesting, or if it was a Batman that I didn't have anything to do with, of course I'd look at that. I tried to always remember some stuff that my boss taught me. Not my boss, Jim Shooter, Lord. He now lives in my town. Mary had spoken to him.
Do you see him at all? Do you see him around?
Danny Fingeroth told me what building he lived in. It was behind the post office. And I was waiting for Mary Fran in the car, and I saw him come out of that building. What was I going to do? I slunk down, pulled up my trench coat, and pulled down my hat.
At least
What
you
am I
didn't
going
go-
to say to him? He accused me of killing somebody in print. I mean, he is not a happy guy.
No, and he's not a well-liked guy either.
He's universally, he was
Yeah.
awful to work for.
I'm sure. And yet those years at Marvel, to me, are like some of the most interesting years. And you were smack in the middle of them.
Well, I did agreed to edit G.I. Joe.
And
I
you
got
wrote
some,
Daredevil. You wrote Daredevil after Frank Miller and before he came back for Born
and I
Again.
did a very different
Yeah,
version.
and I'd love to talk about that, but we should talk about your Batman because you're so associated with Batman. What do you think about Batman's
Batman and
humongous-
Neil Adams. Somebody asked me, how does it feel to know your name will always be associated with Neil's? And I said, it's one of those things you live with.
Yeah, he's another guy who's not super likable in my experience, but
If you think about,
great artist.
yeah, he is the most talented person I've ever known. Just raw talent, hand-eye coordination.
Yeah.
But I am a Buddhist, among other weird things. A Buddhist and a Democrat, wow.
Denny, I have to say, I love you. I didn't think I'd end up just really connecting to your values as much as I had no idea from your comics that you were this liberal, this awesome, this colorful, this
I don't
interesting.
think I think
So I
I'm a
just have
guy
to
who
say that.
tries to
Anyway,
have my head screwed
You're
on.
a Buddhist. You're a Buddhist. Keep going.
Anyway, I don't know what I was talking about.
We were talking about Neil Adams and Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to judge people. It's very unhealthy for me.
Yeah.
But another of my
Okay, let me tell you my Neil Adams story. I got to bring it. I don't have it with me today, but I'll see if I can bring it tomorrow. I have one of those collections of Batmans. They're called the Neil Adams.
The
Batman.
Neil Adams, yeah.
So he's in town. I take it to get it signed by him, and he makes like, his Sharpie slips or whatever, and he makes like a splooge of ink, and he goes, "I should charge you for that because it's by me, because it's a work of art, because it came from me."
Yeah.
And he was only joking, like, a little bit.
Yeah.
Like that's how massive his ego was.
Well, he was on television. I don't watch myself on television, but I made an exception because it was PBS and I watched that.
Yeah.
And they gave Neil more time than anybody, and I learned from watching that show that Neil thought of Green Lantern and Green Arrow, and he went to Julie Schwartz and said, I want to draw a Green Lantern, and Julie gave him the Green Lantern. Then they brought in this writer at the end, after all the creative work was done, and I got to write the script, and I thought, oh, even for Neil, this is extreme. He was the last person of the creative people to get associated with that. I wrote those stories thinking Gil Kane was going to do it because he was the artist for that character. And I was more than delighted with the work that Neil did, except twice he rewrote my scripts, and once he rewrote them so they were, the scene he wrote was offensive to me. Julie Schwartz had a right to take my name off of it. I would say nobody had a right to put my name on something that I found so morally reprehensible. And Neil does not understand that. Why I got upset about that.
What was the thing that you got upset
It was the last scene in the two-part drug story.
Sure.
And Speedy's schoolmate died, and he's laying on the...
Whose idea was it, first of all, that Speedy got addicted to heroin? Was that yours or somebody else?
It was probably mine because we needed to have a sympathetic character that people already knew. I didn't want to invent a character specifically to kill off.
But the idea
heroin.
of having the heroin issue come up, was that Schwartz's? Was that yours?
Probably mine.
That was yours. Okay. That seems like you now that I'm talking to you. That seems to totally make sense.
Yeah, but the way Neil rewrote me, Green Arrow and Speedy are facing each other over this corpse, and Speedy punches Green Lantern, and Green Lantern says, "Oh, I know the kid's okay now."
Right.
So, yeah, a punch in the face solves something as complex as drug addiction.
Yeah.
It was horrible.
That is horrible.
And as I said, Neil and Jim Shooter and Donald Trump, all people who are narcissists, and they cannot admit they're wrong.
Sure. Your Green Lantern, Green Arrow stories and your Batman stories, your Detective Comic stories, the thing that I noticed in common, and I saw this as well with the Daredevil later on, is that they're sort of in the detective mold. Did you read a lot of detective fiction? Was that how you approached it?
I was reading several Private Eye novels a month. And Julie...
That was a passion of yours.
Yeah, it was a form of fiction that I like. I always thought when I retired I was going to write a Private Eye novel.
Sure.
I published some stories in Ellery Queen and places like that. And Julie was more a fan of the old-fashioned kind of locker room mysteries. So the one time that we actually brought it off, we did a story that was like a Batman story crossed with Ellery Queen.
Was it the ship one? Was it the sunken ship one?
No, that was also pretty good in that I figured out a way for the bad guy to do that. But it was a story about
was it the
a
Nazi?
circus. No, that was Carlin Ellison's idea over dinner. It was a story about a sideshow trapped on a mountaintop. One of them is a murderer, and Batman is also trapped. It's going to be a week before anybody can get back to civilization. If you look at the art carefully, you will know who the killer is before Batman. And Julie had me put in one of those cute captions. Well, not even Batman knows who the killer is. Do you know who the killer is? Right. So that was a classic detective story. We played fair with the audience, and it worked. So I have always been proud of that. As it's not the best story I ever wrote by a long way.
I don't know it, unfortunately.
But it's
where you really
it's craftsmanship.
The detective model.
So at that time, I was thinking that, well, Green Lantern, Green Arrow is me being political, and Batman is pure storytelling.
Yeah, I can see that now.
Little did I know that my wife would years later flirt with the guy who played him on television. Nice going, babe.
With Adam West?
Yeah, we didn't see each other for 30 years, and when we got back together, of the people from my past that she didn't know about, she loved Neil and Jerry Conway and Stan.
When Adam West died and when Stan Lee died, people just poured so much adoration for these people online that just boggled my mind, because to me they were nowhere near as interesting as people who had really taken interesting directions or choices.
Yeah, I mean, Stan and Julie reinvented comics, and we wouldn't be here without them. But another Stan Lee story, since Flo Steinberg has put this in print, I can tell it. I was a hippie and I wore buttons, political buttons. I'm wearing one now.
Sure. He's wearing a peace sign, by the way.
Yeah. And so I do not like marijuana. I lived above drug dealers. I had access to it, didn't like it. But I wore a button saying, let's legalize pot, because I thought if alcohol is legal, a much more benevolent drug should be legal.
Sure.
And Stan came in and said, "Oh, what do you got today?" And his face dropped. He tore it off my jacket, flung it in the wastebasket, and said, "If you're going to work for me, you're going to have to give up certain things, and that's one of them." And, like Flo and I just, what happened?
Well, what's funny is Stan always sort of passed himself off in his writing,
as a really hip guy.
Which he wasn't.
No, he was a middle-class blue-collar guy.
He was a company man.
I was
That's what he was.
in a car with him, and I mentioned that I had seen Citizen Kane for the third time the previous night, and he couldn't understand why anybody wanted to see a movie more than once. You know how it ends.
Yeah, it's all about Rosebud. That's all it's about. Yeah.
So he was.
I'm sorry, I'm not a Stan fan. Stan couldn't write to save his life. And sometimes when I look at stuff, like a friend of mine and I were in a comic book store the other day, and there was this omnibus of Gene Colan, Daredevil, and I was like, this art is beautiful, it's on sale, but what is killing me is that Stan's written all over it, and he's taken these beautiful panels and he's put something like, you know, gee, I gotta go run after that. Like, it was just ridiculous stuff. It was just.
But he psychologically gave me permission to start reading comics because I was very lonely in a little town, and there were two liberals in town. We did not tell anybody that we were helping the black community clandestinely. And
it's amazing. This guy's amazing. Hey, go on.
I started reading comics, and I liked them. They were Stan's early stuff, and he wasn't taking it seriously. They were self-satirical captions. He made up funny names for the credits, and he gave those people credits. Nobody had ever colorist or letterer.
Sure.
So he obviously wasn't taking it seriously, and there was me, Navy veteran, participant in one of the major military actions of the century, college graduate, and it was okay for me to read this stuff because it's just silly. I think I was responding to the stories, but Stan's approach to dialogue, for example, comic book dialogue was very dull because people were afraid of the comics code.
Sure.
And one of the things that they insisted on was proper English. Really stupid. But Stan just ignored all that. He ignored the rule that said you can't have continued stories. He told me, well, I just didn't feel like making up 12 plots a year for Daredevil or Spider-Man. So he invented a way of working. He would spend 15 minutes with Kirby or an hour with Colan, and they would talk over a story, and then the artist would go home and draw it, and he'd bring in the art, and Stan would then do the script.
Sure.
I worked that way for a couple of years and decided it was probably right for Stan because of his workload, but it was not a great way to write comics. I had no control over the pacing. A lot of young artists thought comic books are a guy in a funny suit smashing a wall. And really what they're about is the quiet stuff. If you can bring off a dialogue scene and make that interesting, then you're a real artist. It's pretty easy to do action.
Absolutely. And pacing and storytelling, those are the things that...
Yeah, that's the last thing a writer learns, pacing. I mean, I don't know of any book... the best advice I have for people is be familiar with comics, but also read a lot of stuff. I think everything that's happened in my life has gone into comics, including the 2 years I lived on an aircraft carrier. I was as surprised as anybody when I needed an aircraft carrier for a story.
When were you living on an aircraft carrier? Were you
I was
in the military?
Yes,
you said you were in the Navy.
I was both a peacenik and a warmonger. I went in buying the whole package that we were sold in Catholic schools. If we don't stop the commies in Southeast Asia, they're going to be raping our moms. And it was all nonsense. And then later on, by inches, the real story came out.
Yeah.
I once did a newspaper story on the two guys who were actually reporters doing the job. That is, not getting their stories in the hotel bar at 5 o'clock by going out and getting shot at. There were only two of them. One worked for the Times and one worked for Time magazine.
Just before we leave Batman, I want to ask you, how do you feel about how popular he's become now? And is there something central to Batman that you connected with that you feel is either eternal or has changed?
Well, I was doing a lot of different superheroes, and I did a year's worth of Superman, which they were generous enough to reprint. But Superman gave me practical writer's problems. He is a guy who blew out a sun like a birthday candle, who could search every room in his city in a second. If you're going to be consistent, and that's one of the things you're supposed to be if you write fiction, how do you give that guy a real problem without stopping the story dead to explain why he didn't do this month what he did last month?
Right.
Whereas with Batman, anybody can understand the grief that a kid would feel seeing his parents killed, and you could get him in trouble. You could put him in traps. I had a different concept of Bruce Wayne, and I never got any of my writers to do my Bruce Wayne.
Who was your Bruce Wayne? How was he different?
The first of the movies with the... okay, I'll be right with you.
Can you give me 10 minutes? Is that okay?
Split it at 5.
Okay, sure.
We have to get him back.
Sure, I'll make it 5.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I showed the movie to an audience recently, and I can't think of... The director was Tim Burton, and...
Batman Returns?
No, it was the very first one. It was just called Batman. And Danny and I showed that and then led a discussion afterwards, Danny Fingeroth. But I could relate to him. I mean, there are two kinds of mythology. There's God mythology and there's hero mythology. And by accident, Batman and Superman split it down the middle. Superman is a god.
Gotcha.
And Batman is very, very human and very, very fallible. Therefore, to me, he's a much more interesting guy to write about.
Gotcha. I've only got a couple more minutes with you, so I got to ask these two questions. One, how did you approach Daredevil? Because you said you did it different from Miller. And then, were you unhappy with the way Batman went with Dark Knight Returns and The Killing Joke and what that did to comics?
I edited The Killing Joke, and it was the first Batman editing job I did, and I spent most of an afternoon reading it. That guy loves to type. Boy.
Oh, yeah, sure. I've got a copy of that script.
Yeah.
It's like 100 pages long.
Yeah, I mean, the first, it's 2 single-space pages, and that's panel 1 of the first page.
Yeah, yeah. But, you know,
it works for him. He has a way of working that couldn't work for me, but he makes it work.
But did he like the material? Did he like what he did with it?
I went to my boss, and the script had been in the house for a year at that point, and my predecessor obviously didn't know what to do with it. So I said, 2 choices here. We print this as it's written, or we don't print it. I don't want to ruin this story by imposing my sensibility on a very different sensibility.
Sure.
And Jeanette, bless her, understood that and agreed. So I didn't touch it. I edited.
Were you happy with it, though?
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. There was fallout. I got a lot of some nasty letters and nasty phone calls because sometimes I can be really stupid. I thought it's got a $5 price point. That's going to keep it out of the hands of kids. I didn't realize that grandmas buy comic books.
But it
for
changed
kids.
Comics. That and Dark Knight Returns changed comics. Like, they were more violent, they were more gritty.
It was very strong sexual subtext.
Subtext.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would never have written it, but I'm glad he did. I'm glad it's part of the canon.
And if I can ask you quickly, what was your approach to Daredevil? What was your thinking around Daredevil?
Well, I thought I was doing Frank's Daredevil, and then after I'd been doing it for 6 months, Frank said, I got to either stop having dinner with you or stop reading your Daredevil because you're getting it all wrong. And I said,
okay.
Okay.
But you're okay with that? You weren't pissed?
I was...
Because you had that Gladiator story just taken out from under
Frank,
your feet.
There's one basic difference. I looked at the Daredevil TV show last week. I binge-watched it. And it is so goddamn Catholic.
Yeah.
And Frank is one of us former Catholics. I've got a T-shirt that says Recovered Catholic. It's just drenched in Catholic mindset.
Sure, absolutely.
And my Batman was a Zen guy, a Buddhist,
Gotcha.
who made himself one with his environment and therefore didn't need to see.
Gotcha.
So there's never any one right way to do any of these characters. There have been about 5 Batmans. Everyone has been right for its time. I can't read this stuff from the 50s, but for the 50s it was fine.
Gotcha. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Coming up, comics creator and animator Sam Agro about what attracted him to animation, the evolution of comics conventions, and much more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support. When you watched Batman as a kid, you enjoyed the colorful heroes and villains, the text sound effects on the screen, the thrill of watching a heroic crime fighter escaping from death traps and taking down bad guys. But the show was devised to interest adults too. What did you miss as a kid? Sexual innuendo.
The penguin's too small for me.
Closeted gay characters.
I like that cape, Batman.
Freudian death traps.
Has the giant clam really swallowed Robin?
Police incompetence.
Bruce Wayne is a millionaire playboy. Hardly a secret identity for Batman.
Whether you're a kid or an adult, there's something to like about our favorite Caped Crusader. Tim and Paul dig for the deeper meanings under the Batmania every other Thursday. What's the podcast's name?
To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles.
This is Koom for Deconstructing Comics in Toronto, and I'm talking to...
Sam Agro.
Are you a native of Toronto, Sam?
No, I was born in Ontario, in a little town called Tillsonburg, which is just south of London, Ontario. That's the larger center that people are more likely to know. We lived in Port Rowan, actually, for a while, and then we moved to Tillsonburg when I was about 10 years old. And I came to Toronto after school when I was about 22 years old.
I was actually out with a common acquaintance of ours, Rob Walton.
Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, last night. And I asked him about you, and he said you'd gone to Sheridan, I think.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That is correct. I went to I took the animation course at Sheridan. It's a BA course now, but at the time it was just a practical animation course for classical animation. And I went there for 3 years, and I graduated and got my certificate. And most of my career, my main job has been working in the animation business.
Okay, so if you can just tell us a little bit about your foray into comics and kind of where the balance sits between animation and comics these days.
Yeah, well, I've been into comics since I was a pretty little kid. You know, I mean, all little kids are into comics, and then I kind of wasn't into comics for a few years, and then around 12 years old, my dad, for some reason, I don't know why he did this, because he never really did it before, but he came home with a stack of comic books, maybe about 10 comics. And there were all kinds of things in there. There were a couple of DCs, a couple of Marvels, a couple of Archies. It was a real mixed bag. I don't know where he got them, why he brought them home. But in there, there was an Incredible Hulk comic, Incredible Hulk number 150. And I was really into motorcycles at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the big things I was into. And there was a motorcycle gang on the cover of this Hulk comic. And read the comic, and I loved it. I mean, I remember reading the Hulk when I was a little kid, but this was the first time sort of I comprehended the story. And it was also the first time that I sort of got clued into the idea that there were successive issues of comics.
Yeah.
So I was looking at the numbers, and I was going, oh, I see, an issue comes out every month. And so I immediately went to the newsstand, like got on my bike that very afternoon, and went to the newsstand, and I was able to find I was able to find 149 and 151 of Incredible Hulk.
Right.
And that was when I became a collector. I was like, now I want to get all the Hulks.
Gotcha.
So that's sort of when I got into comics. I was very, very young, and I really thought my career was going to be working in comics.
And so you went to Sheridan with a view to use that skill to work in comics?
No, actually, by that time I had sort of shifted over. I really wanted to work in animation. What happened in the meantime was I got really interested in acting. I got involved in the local little theater in Tillsonburg, and I started doing a lot of performing there. And I started doing stand-up comedy at my high school assemblies and so forth. And then one day I went to see, I took a date to see, I guess I was about 17. I took a date to see Disney's The Rescuers.
Mm-hmm.
And I was watching it, and again, it's sort of the same revelation I had with the comics. I was like, oh, this is drawing, but it's also acting. And I kind of got really excited about that. And I was like, oh, so this is a way that I can take my love of drawing, my love of acting, and I can put them together.
You may be the very first person who's ever kind of expressed a love for animation in that unique way, combining those two things.
Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe I can't imagine that it's that unique, but maybe nobody's just ever said it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, that was what got me excited about animation. And from that moment on, I was pretty much on track to get into animation for animation. I really wanted to be an animator.
Well, have you ever met anybody who wanted to be an actor but like got drawn to animation? I think that's a very unusual kind of path or combination, which I think is really interesting because you've got all these interesting interests.
Yeah, well, that's probably my big problem, Koom. I have a lot of varied interests, and I've sort of become competent at various different things, but I've never really become exceptionally good at anything.
I share that with you. Like, that's pretty much the story of my high school. I also did stand-up at a high school arts thing, and it was so unusual because nobody else did anything like that. Everybody kind of just looked at me weird more than they laughed, although I did get some laughs. And then I did 2 of those sets, and I never did it again just because I was not really in the drama crowd, but I wanted to be anyway. But I just thought that was kind of interesting. I just ended up writing in the end, but
yeah. Well, I'm a writer. I'm a cartoonist. I'm an illustrator. I'm a comic book guy. I'm an actor. I'm mostly I do improv and sketch comedy, but I do a little straight up acting as well.
So you're still doing that?
Yes, to a lesser degree. Now that I'm pushing 60.
No way! Wow.
Yeah, I'm going to be 59 in September. So
many happy returns. Well, it's a little early, but still.
It's a little early, but I guess what I'm saying is I just don't have the energy to do a lot of different things anymore.
Yeah, I hear you.
So after I got into the animation business professionally, and I sort of settled in Toronto, I discovered Theater Sports, which is an improv comedy show here in Toronto. It was quite a popular show at the time. It's there's still a lot of improv happening in Toronto, There are many more alternatives. But at that time in the mid '80s, when I was getting into it, it was mostly theater sports was the big improv thing going on in Toronto.
Right.
And I got originally involved in that, and we had a team that performed. Theater sports is sort of set up like a mock competition between teams, and they get scored, and one team wins, right? And
I've seen an improv thing like that. If it's purely improv, then I've seen it.
Yeah, and so that group that I got involved with, Dangerous Poultry, went on to do a lot of sketch comedy. We used to perform regularly at the Rivoli, and we went out to the Edmonton Fringe a few times and did our show out there. And you know, so I did that, and actually there was a while when I thought maybe that was going to end up being my career. I was still working a day job in animation, but I was really interested in comedy, and I really wanted to do it professionally, but I wasn't able to make that conversion. Although one of the other people in the troupe, a guy named Gary Pearson, went on to become quite successful in the comedy business, and he just had a show. I'm trying to remember the name of the show now. It's the Name of the Town. It was on CBC. No, it wasn't. It was on CTV.
It's not Schitt's Creek, is it?
No, it's not Schitt's Creek. No, it's like a town and characters recur, but it's really a sketch show.
I don't watch a lot of TV, so I might have heard of it, but probably never seen it.
The title is escaping me now because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm pushing 60, so my memory's not what it used to be. But anyway, he's done quite well for himself. I'm gonna research that and get back to you with the correct title.
Sure.
He and Dan Redican from the Frantics produced the show and were the showrunners and did some of the writing as well, I assume.
Is there a connection between all of these interests? Like, do you have an interest in comics that's more in line with comedy or with animation as opposed to the more, graphic novel type stuff or the pure action stuff?
I don't really. I love all comics pretty much equally. I love a good, funny, cartoony comic. Rob Walton, who you were talking to, is very talented.
And he's been on our podcast a few times. He started doing kind of discussions about comics with me. So we just he knows a lot about comics history. So he's somebody good to have on the show, and he's also very witty and charming. So that's good. And the payment for making those statements is in the mail, I'm sure. But, no, he's a really good guy, and his stuff is satirical and funny, and the drawings are beautiful cartoon style drawings. Yes,
I love that kind of stuff. But I also love a good superhero punch 'em up, and I love a good horror story, and I have quite a lot of genres that I enjoy. So. My idea of getting into comics wasn't specifically to do animation style comedy. It was just to, the big dream when you get into animation is you want to work for Disney.
Right.
Unfortunately, that never happened for me. But I ended up working for Nelvana for a long time, and I've worked for many other companies.
Did you, ever know Joe Matt's girlfriend? I was just thinking about, in Peep Show he chronicled Trish's, trajectory.
I met her one time at a party. They were both there. I can't remember what the context of the party was. I did meet them one time, and I spoke with them both very briefly.
Okay, because she's at Disney now, I think.
Is she?
Well, she was... From what I remember in his comics, they haven't been together for ages.
Yeah, they broke up not too long after I met them, I think.
Okay, maybe you caused it. I don't know. How about?
I don't remember meddling, but hopefully I didn't. Hopefully I didn't cause the breakup.
I think the relationship had a lot of internal problems. But
based on his comics, I think his personal issues were probably more to blame. But
I remember this one strip he did where she's going to school and she comes back home and shows him an assignment she's working on, and it's just like this motion study of a Disney character or something, like jumping on a diving board or something like that. And then his reaction is, bah, animation. Why are you drawing these? Why can't you, like, at least draw Looney Tunes characters? At least they're more interesting. She's like, why can't you just support me? Why can't you just say something nice?
Yeah, he's a bit of a misanthrope, I guess. He doesn't really understand how to. He seemed very nice when I met him, and that was the one and only time I met him. Actually, I think he was living in Toronto at that time, but I think he moved shortly after that. So I've never met him in person since that, and it was like, I don't know, in the 90s somewhere, 94, 95.
Well, yeah, that's around the time I knew him, maybe around 97. But yeah, I don't know. He's supposed to have gone to LA and kind of tried to change his life, but the posts I see on Facebook are still pretty reminiscent of the old Joe from the comics. But anyway, just to get back to you, so what did you do in comics? Forgive me for not knowing more. I did try to look you up online, but you come up more as an animator rather than
Oh, really? Well, that surprises me a little bit, but
maybe I just didn't dig deep enough.
In terms of credits, like if you're looking up credits, you'll find a lot of animation shows that I worked on over the years, for sure. I started off, I did a couple of parody comics. I did a parody comic of The Punisher, which I wrote and drew some of, and some
that I did see an image of. Could you tell me a bit more about that? Because I used to be a Punisher fan in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah. Well, I was living with Ty Templeton at that time. We were roommates. And he had done a parody for this publisher again, whose name I should have researched my history, so I had all these names at my fingertips. But I want to say Don Chin, maybe. Anyway, this publisher had published a parody of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles called the Radioactive Hamsters or something, the Radioactive something Hamsters.
Right.
Which Ty had worked on. And so he knew this publisher. And this guy was looking for somebody to do a parody comic of The Punisher. He wanted it to be The Pummeler. And he had a story that was written by Mike Barron.
Who actually did work on some Punisher stuff.
Yeah, he did work on some Punisher stuff, and he wrote this one parody, 8-page or 10-page parody, which I drew. And then there were a couple other parodies. There was one that I penciled, and there were a couple of pages that I wrote and drew. And
did that do well? Did you get any flack from Marvel?
No, as far as I know, they just considered it, sort of fair parody, and I think he did fairly well with that book. It was actually a nice-looking comic, though black and white. I
think that's what I saw an image from, but I just assumed it was like a later Punisher story, once the art style started to vary and they did, odd little tales here and there. I didn't realize it was a parody.
I may not have the year quite right. I don't know what year that was. I think it was still in the 90s. I don't think it was in the 2000s, but it might have been barely inside the 2000s.
It would have been the 90s, would be my guess, because that's when he and Wolverine were really kind of...
Yeah, it was a long time ago anyway. So that was sort of the first thing that I ever did in comics. And then I spent a long time, going to conventions, trying to corner editors, show them my samples, and... I just never had any luck. I don't know. I mean, some of my early work probably wasn't good enough. But later on, I think I did some really good samples. But the styles were changing. I was still kind of influenced by the 70s comics, which is what I grew up on. And so I would often get people later on when I was trying to show samples. People would say, "Well, this is it's good, but it's old school. It doesn't feel modern."
And the irony is the image stuff was just horrible, but that's what people wanted at the time.
Yeah, and that's really when I was making my big push to break in. So my timing was very bad there, and
But it's not a bad thing in a way, because imagine you drawn in that style, you wouldn't be able to look at that stuff now.
Well, I don't know. I mean, some of those guys got very rich off of it, so
Yes, that's
I don't know.
true.
Not that money is the only thing, draws me to comics, but so anyway, then later on, Ty Templeton was kind enough to get me in touch with one of the editors at DC on the Looney Tunes comic.
Mm-hmm.
This was an editor that he had worked with before, so my biggest claim to fame in comics is actually a writing job, not a drawing job, and that is writing on the Looney Tunes comic, which I did for about 4.5 years, maybe doing 30 pages of comics a year, because they were short stories, right? So you would pitch them a story, and it would be a 4-page or 6-page story, or even a 1-page gag, right?
Yeah.
So this was the Looney Tunes, all the old Warner Brother characters, which, of course, that's a connection between comics and animation for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they were, those were characters that I grew up with and I really loved, and having the chance to write them was really a lot of fun for me.
I'm surprised they didn't just get you to draw them as well, given your animation training.
I tried to pitch her 4 or 5 times on letting me draw a story of my own, and she said, "No, we got enough guys." And I'm like, "Okay."
Mm-hmm. Who was your editor?
Again, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm going to find out for you because
no worries. You don't have to.
No, I have one of the comics right here, actually.
Oh, okay, cool. Because
conveniently located. So
I'm going to send this to my editor as soon as we finish. He's waiting to stitch up this episode. Yeah, you're kind of the second half with Denny O'Neil.
Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah. Well, he's got much more comics bona fides than I have.
He was amazing. I really, really, really liked meeting him. I just had no idea he was that awesome in person.
Well, I'm glad that he turned out to be awesome. It's always a bit of a drag when you meet somebody and you kind of find out they're not so...
Yeah, and I met enough people who are veterans of the industry who are sort of cynical, and they're kind of slightly curmudgeonly, and they're just like, give me the money and I'll sign your memorabilia, and comics has been shitty to me. And Denny O'Neil was like none of those things. He was,
well, that's very nice to hear.
He was incredible. Yeah.
I only spoke to him briefly at the convention, but he seemed very nice.
Well, when you listen to the whole episode, it'll just... I wish I'd kept my recorder running at the end, because he was making jokes about how old he was, and he was just so full of life and character, and was very humble, really, throughout it all.
Well, that's very good. I mean, like you say, sometimes those guys get a little bit bitter, and understandably so, because comics is a tough business.
Yeah.
But it's always nice when you find one that still sort of has a spark. Mind you, his career maybe was a little bit longer than some of those other guys that kind of got, just dumped, a lot of...
That is true, but it's weird because he was a company man, but at the same time, he was really honest and liberal and frank. He put, in my talking with him, Donald Trump, Jim Shooter, and Neil Adams in the same categories together. He said they were all just fantastic narcissists.
Well, I can't speak to that personally because I don't know them all that well, but I'm sure Denny has the inside scoop on that.
I was just so amazed that I didn't get a chance to float my pet theory by him, which is that Donald Trump might have had Stan Lee killed off. That's
well, that's a bit of a conspiracy theory. What's your logic on that?
Well, I have two possible angles. The first one, I don't know which one is more likely, but the first one is that Donald Trump and Stan Lee were in secret talks to do a takeover of Marvel Comics or Marvel Entertainment, and then things went sour, and then Donald Trump blamed Stan Lee for it, and then had him bumped.
So you think So you think he waited until he was incredibly old and then had him whacked?
Yeah, in league with Stanley's daughter. Or my other theory, which might be slightly even less credible, is that Don wanted to be known as Don the Man or Don the Mon, and he needed to bump Stan the Man off because Stan just wouldn't give up his nickname.
Yeah, he wanted that nickname.
Yeah, and so
that's pretty out there, Koom. I don't know.
We'll see. In about a year, if Don starts to become Don the Mon, then we'll know that.
Well, that's a good crackpot theory, Koom. I appreciate those. That's a good one. Okay, so my editor on the Looney Tunes comic, my original editor was Joan Hilty.
Okay, I don't know who that is.
Yeah, well, she worked off and on for DC for quite a while, and she moved over. At one point, she moved over to what was their indie side?
Vertigo.
Vertigo. She moved over to Vertigo, and I did pitch her some ideas there, but she sort of, in her mind, I was kind of a comedy guy, and
gotcha.
Editors, I love them, but they tend to pigeonhole you.
Yeah.
So she saw me as a comedy writer, and she couldn't take my pitches too seriously.
Yeah, well, Rob has a really good Vertigo story if you ask him about it sometime.
Oh, I'll have to find out about that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
He lives actually not far from me, and
he says he's not too far from you. Yeah.
Yeah, and when he gets a new artist edition, I usually go over and have a little tea and look over the artist edition.
Oh, nice. We should all do that sometime because, I visit him and then he always wants to pull out the artist editions. And I'm like, no, don't bother because they're all the way upstairs and, But
no, it's good because you get to look at some great comic book art, and then you sit around and yak for a while just about how great those guys were, and how different things are now, and it's a good experience and a good conversation starter.
Yeah, I guess one thing that's neat about the both of you is that you're still very much dyed-in-the-wool fans, and not all people who work in comics retain that fan enthusiasm.
Well, I am a fan, but I'll be honest, I don't buy a lot of modern comics.
Neither do I, except the indie stuff.
At least not from Marvel and DC. I've been reading Paper Girls and I've been reading Saga, and I still read comics for sure. But honestly, a great afternoon for me is pulling out a Marvel Essentials, Fantastic Four from the 60s, and I sort of get more enjoyment out of that because
I'm with you. I've just been reading the very last leg of the Kirby stuff for Fantastic Four, and I think his art was just so top notch. Like, it's just so dynamic, and those pages with the 4 panels where they're just so strong.
Yeah.
I mean, oh my God, it's just incredible. Like, you almost don't care about the story. Many of those episodes are just one-offs.
There's certainly some fun stories in there. Some of them are goofy.
Oh no, they're enjoyable. It's just I'm just saying they don't really, you don't walk away with some big saga or something, but just.
Yeah, well, any storyline was wrapped up in a couple of issues. It was never you never had these long arcs.
I guess no, but didn't they have? I thought they had slightly longer storylines with Galactus, or were those only 2 issues?
I think Galactus's original appearance, I think, is maybe 2.5 issues. It's really funny actually because he arrives literally in the middle. They wrap up some other story. And then literally in the middle of the comic, that's when the Galactus one starts. It's very weird. I can't remember which issue it actually happens in, but it's literally there's a story that they started in the issue before.
Yeah.
Is everything all right?
Yeah.
I heard a beep.
I don't know what that was. Maybe traffic.
All right. So they finish up this other story after 6 or 7 pages, and then literally they just jump into the Galactus one. So it might be 2.5 issues, but it's not very long, and rarely did they do anything. They would do a cliffhanger, and then they would wrap it up in the next issue. So it was almost always a 2-issue. They would have ongoing storylines, but the villain story was usually no more than 2, maybe 2.5, 3.
Right.
So they were pretty short arcs, really, at that time. Later on, they got a lot longer.
I do want to ask you about the convention.
Sure.
From what I understand, you've been doing conventions, at least in Toronto, for a long time. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, was this convention different than usual or very much the same kind as usual? I know you posted about it on Facebook, so I don't know if you'd feel a bit bored going over this stuff again. But
No, it's fine. I think, the Toronto Comicon is, I usually do just the two. I do Toronto Comicon and then I do Fan Expo.
Right.
And that's primarily because of James Armstrong, because way, way back when I was still in college and he was in high school, that's when we met. He was a big comics fan. I was a big comics fan.
So is James Armstrong an organizer? I just kind of know Kevin Boyd.
Yeah, well, Kevin deals with the talent.
Yeah.
Right? He deals with Artist Alley and all of that stuff. But James is a little bit higher up in the organization.
Does he work for Informa?
Yes, they both work for Informa now, but before that, it was, what was the company that ran it before that? It was a local company that built it up.
I see.
But Fan Expo, before it was Fan Expo, like 25 years ago, that's when I first got involved.
So what were the cons like then? Because from what I remember, see, I'm 43, so I started going to cons when I was in high school, and they were these little things at the Hilton Hotel, and I loved them.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Yeah, so at what point did it switch over into this bigger thing? Do you
I would be hard-pressed to really nail down the year that things started to change, but originally what happened was I was working on the Care Bears TV show as a layout.
Like the original Care Bears TV show? In the 80s?
Well, I worked on the two of the feature films that Nelvana did.
Okay.
And I worked on the series. Which
would have been early 80s, right?
Yeah, I guess so. It was going back a long time.
Wow.
Anyway, James Armstrong had a comic book store in Oakville, and he invited me to come and do a sort of a signing, draw pictures of Care Bears for the kids.
Right.
So I did it. And then a few years later, they started to do a comic convention here in Toronto. And it was in hotels or whatever. And it was very small. Maybe 2,000, 2,500 people came in those early days.
And on like one day, right?
I think it started out one day, because there was just no reason to go longer than that.
Yeah.
And so the first few years, I was just there with my storyboards for the Care Bears, and also I had some storyboards from Ewoks and Droids. And I would have my storyboards for people to look at, and I would do sketches for free. And, I just came down to they would have a few big-name comic book guys. Anyway, they were very, very small affairs, and I was just there because there would be a few real comic book people that I could meet,
Yeah,
and
that's why I went, and just to pick up issues I didn't have to fill in. Yeah.
But after a few years, it started to grow, and there would be 5,000, 6,000 people coming through there, and I sort of noticed that, and James sort of always called me in to do the show, and I kind of noticed that there were some cartoonists there selling sketches of superheroes and stuff. So I said, "Oh, hey, I can do that and actually make some money doing this," because I was doing it all for free at first.
Right.
And so I started to do that. I started to bring in sketches, and people started to buy them. And so I was sort of grandfathered in because I've been doing it sort of almost from the beginning.
Right.
And so, but then eventually it became a fairly big event. It became a 2-day event, and then they sort of turned it into Fan Expo. And that was when things really changed. Because what they did was it wasn't just comics anymore. It was comics, and it was anime, and it was gaming, and it was science fiction. And they started to bring in the TV and the movie people. And the numbers just started to skyrocket, and they've been increasing every year since then.
When did cosplay become a thing? Because I'm still kind of getting used to it personally. I don't really like it myself, although...
There was always cosplay, even in the very early days. I remember people coming in costume, and they usually had a costume parade at one point during the convention.
I've seen old photos from the New York conventions where, like, you'd see Wendy Pini in a Red Sonja outfit or whatever. But I felt like that was sort of, like, relegated to, like, one event or one space on stage, whereas now cosplay is the background.
They would introduce each other. They would introduce everybody that was wearing a costume and sort of saying, this is so-and-so wearing this costume, and then there would usually be a few prizes given for it.
But it was kind of special. It was like an odd thing, whereas now it's the backdrop to the convention.
Yeah, well, again, I think that really started to change when they brought anime in. Anime and gaming, because the anime cosplayers like really upped the ante. And for a while, it was funny because it was always comic book heroes. And then after the anime people started coming in, for a while, the comic book costume people just weren't showing up.
Right.
But then eventually they started to reincorporate, and now you see everything. I mean,
you do
cosplay of everything you can possibly imagine. But I think the sort of the rise of cosplay really grew out of anime. As this is just my observation. I don't know if that's factual. I'm just saying from my observation on one convention, that's where that was sort of ground zero for the really elaborate costumes and the really finished costumes.
Right.
Like before that, they were sort of like homemade kind of things, and people still do it that way. But a lot of people got very serious about it and started spending money to make these costumes look fantastic. And I remember associating that with anime.
And maybe manga as well, but anime.
Well, sure, yeah.
Primarily, yeah.
And also video games, that became huge as well.
Sure.
But anyway, so then it became a really big event. So these days, I prefer Toronto Comicon. Because even though they bring in some, movie stars and TV stars, it's a little more focused on the comics, the art, and they tend to bring in, this is the event where they would bring in somebody like Steve Englehart, and Ron Wilson, as they did at this last one. These guys that are sort of more classic guys that aren't maybe going to a lot of conventions.
Yeah.
Whereas the Fan Expo tends to be the really big name guys more so. So I prefer it because I get to meet a lot of people from when I was reading comics, and it's just a little more. There's not quite as many people. It's a little more relaxed, and I can sort of hang out with the local comic people. So I always have a really good time as a fan at Toronto Comicon.
Did you feel that this Toronto Comicon was different from others? Were things changing? Like, to me, it seemed like one thing I noticed was that there were less vendors selling comic books and more people selling merchandise. So you weren't having as many variations of comic books. You just had the dealers selling the really collectible slabbed stuff. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's been a slow change, I think. But I agree with you. But what you have to kind of remember is that younger people aren't collecting comics.
I know.
We used to. They don't necessarily care about having the physical item.
And I don't think the mainstream companies are really looking at making comics in the same way. They're not making these series that have a particularly memorable storyline or a saga or a character development or something. It's about an appendage that kind of fits in with the movie franchise or with some animation or some product line or something. So, like, this is an extra bit of memorabilia for you to collect.
Yeah, well, I think there is some of that going on, but I mean, I think there's still great comics being made, and there's certainly more comics being made than ever in history.
I agree, but I think the thinking that is kind of going behind closed doors at comic book companies, or at least the ones that are more mainstream, is that how can we market to this particular demographic shift?
Yeah. Well, that's because, you know, there's been a lot of success with comic book movies now. So so these companies are looking for something that they can roll out into other media and make serious big money, because there's no serious big money in just comics, right?
Right.
So I understand it, and
do you go to the movies? Do you follow all of this stuff?
I don't go to all the movies, but I go to the movies for sure. Yeah, I mean, you know, I love, you know, I'll go see an Ant-Man, and I'll go see Ms. Marvel, and
sure.
You know, I mean, I don't go to everything. I'm not a big fan. I was never a big fan of team comics. FF was sort of my favorite team because there was more of them.
Yeah, me too.
You know, and I did follow X-Men when you know, Claremont and Byrne were doing their run for sure. But generally speaking, I'd rather have a comic. I'd rather read a comic about a single character,
sure,
or a small team than a big team.
They're just better written, I think.
So I haven't been going to like I sort of lost my patience with Avengers when the cast started to become, you know, 30 superheroes, right? Because I just don't think you can tell a really good story and have that many characters and give every character a good moment. Like I just don't think it's possible. So I haven't been sort of like the whole, you know, the last 3 movies, or the last 2 movies and the one that's about to come out. I haven't really seen those Avengers movies.
Yeah,
but I mean, I've seen.
I don't like them. I just have to be honest with you, and I have to say, like, I've given my fair shake. At trying them, and they just never fail to disappoint me. Yeah, maybe the last.
I mean, I like the first 2 Captain Americas. I like the first Iron Man. I like the first Thor. I even like the Hulk they made with what's his name?
Ed Norton.
Yeah, the Ed Norton Hulk.
No, that wasn't bad. It's
a pretty decent movie.
It's just I'm a big film fan, and these don't make an impression on me in any way except as like sort of product. But I'm not a Disney fan either, I should say. And to me, Disney and Marvel have become.
I really liked Black Panther. I thought that was awesome.
I know, but to me,
I'm not as big a fan of the DC movies, although I really liked Wonder Woman. So I don't know. I mean, I still think these are mostly fun movies. I don't go to every one. Like I have no interest in Deadpool as a character. I never liked the character.
Sure.
So I just don't go to the movies because I just don't like the character.
Well, Rob Walton and I went to go see the new Jordan Peele movie yesterday, and it's a horror movie, right, called Us. Even given its failings, at least it gave us something to talk about. It was memorable. Like, I don't find the Marvel movies are like that. They're just pure, like, confection and escapism. And I just think, if Jordan Peele made a Black Panther, that would be interesting.
Well, I think that would be extremely interesting. Unfortunately, what happens is that there's too much committee on these big movies.
Right.
But even in spite of that, I think Marvel has made several really good ones. So I don't know. I'm not quite as negative about it as you are.
Fair enough.
And some of them have made a really strong impression on me, including Black Panther. So, you know, I don't know. Some I like a lot.
I've enjoyed a few, but I have to go back. Like, to me, when I saw the first Iron Man, that just seemed somewhat fresh because I hadn't seen all of the movies that came afterwards. And then I took my friend's kids to go see Spider-Man: Homecoming, and I really like that. But I don't know if that's because I was with my friend's kids.
Well, that might have made a difference.
Yeah, I wanted us all to enjoy it.
Is excellent. Have you seen that yet?
Which one, sorry?
Into the Spider-Verse?
I went to go see it because of the hype. But like I say, I think as a kid I would have enjoyed it maybe. Like when I was in high school and when collecting comics and being into comics was really looked down upon, I would have probably been really happy to have all of this stuff to go see. But I didn't really think about it afterwards. I think my biggest problem is, and it's what kind of Alan Moore's criticized them for as well. It's just they're just rehashing stuff that Kirby and Lee and others did back in the 60s, and besides, like, you know, variations on the suits or the technology or whatever, there's nothing really new in them, and there's
but again,
something wrong with that.
Remember, I prefer to spend my afternoon reading old Marvel comics.
But I do too. But that stuff was fresh. It was innovative for its time.
Oh, it's fresh at the time, but it's fresh now. I mean, I've read all those comics a dozen times. So I don't know. For me, if they actually capture some of that, I'm happy.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm happy to disagree with you. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I wouldn't take anybody's enjoyment away.
I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm just saying you and I differ there. That's
yeah.
No, but anyway, you know, I don't know. I still really enjoy the comic book events, but some of that is just sort of like one of the posts I made was the Brotherhood of Comics, right? Which is, and I say brotherhood, I mean brotherhood and sisterhood now, but you know, I get to see the local guys that I kind of see twice a year.
Sure.
Right? And, you know, there's a few that I hang out with sometimes like Rob, but a lot of them I mostly see at conventions.
Yeah, and they're great. By the way, if it wasn't for Mike Ruth, I wouldn't have met you. So
there you go.
He's another awesome guy that...
Oh, he's a terrific guy and has become a fantastic artist, really great illustrator.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's doing some super work right now. Yeah, he's doing very well. So, so, I mean, that's part of what I enjoy about that event. And for me, I can enjoy it better at Toronto Comicon than Fan Expo because I'm not worried about being at my table all the time. And, you know, I'm just, you know, I have a little more freedom to kind of go and hang out with people and also to meet sort of the classic creators that I grew up with. And so to me, as a fan, I really love Comic-Con more than Fan Expo.
Yeah.
But Fan Expo is where I make the money.
I see.
Yeah, I make more money at Fan Expo.
So just before we wrap up, was there anything special or unusual about this particular Comic-Con that you want to remark on?
I don't think there was anything unusual, really. No, nothing. I wouldn't say there's anything that made it stand out particularly. But I had a really good time, and you know, I got to do some cool sketches, and that's always fun. You know, it's always fun when I get to draw a character I've never drawn before. Mm-hmm. And somebody got a commission from me for Kraven the Hunter, which is a character I've never drawn before.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love that. I just go, oh yeah, Kraven the Hunter. I'm dying to draw that guy, you know.
Sure.
So I get a great deal of enjoyment out of that when somebody asks me for a character that's a little offbeat or a little less popular now.
Sure.
I love it, man. So
did you get a chance to talk to Mike Zack and John Beatty? I found it very nice.
I spoke to them briefly, mostly sort of. I've met them both before, and I have signatures and so forth from both of them. Mm-hmm. So they weren't sort of first on my list, but I always stop by all the creators coming in from out of town. I always stop by and just say hi, welcome to Toronto. Hope your trip is good. Hope everything with the convention goes smoothly, and you know, I try to sort of be an ambassador for Toronto.
That's great, Sam.
Yeah. So I spoke to him, but I spent a lot more time talking with Ron Wilson, and I didn't get to speak to Denny so much, but Ron Wilson and. I
wish I'd talked more to Steve Englehart. I just didn't know his stuff well enough, so I felt a bit shy.
I spoke with him the most of all the guys, all the classic guys that were up. He's very sweet, and I had a couple of brief but nice conversations with him.
He seems like super intelligent. Like he started off as an artist, and I didn't know that until I started reading up on him online.
Yeah, well, I got him to sign my copy of Defenders #1.
Yeah,
which I bought off the stands. When I came over with it, he said, "You look like you might be old enough that you bought this off the stand." I said, "Yes, I did. I was a huge Hulk fan, so." I was there with bells on for the Defenders, and I said to him that one of the sample packs that I did when I was trying to break into comics was a Defenders pack, and he said, "Oh, I'd like to see those." So I brought my old sample pack in of these Defenders pages that I had done to try and break into Marvel, and he looked them over, and he was very He was very complimentary about it, which was nice of him. I think he probably exaggerated how much he liked them a little bit for my benefit, but he said, "Hey, these are good. I'm not sure why he didn't get work." I said, "Well, I was showing samples like this at the height of the Image years, and that just wasn't what they were looking for. It was more focused on the storytelling."
Right.
So, but he was very sweet to say that he thought the samples were solid. So I really appreciate that. That was the big moment of convention for me.
Yeah, that's a great moment to have. I was a big fan of the Hulk too when I was young. I was just curious, what's your favorite Hulk run or storyline?
Very, very briefly, Archie Goodwin wrote the title, only for about 6 or 8 issues. And he wrote some of the coolest stories, I think, that they were ever done. And that was way back in the 70s, very shortly after I started buying the book. So that was really, really early on. There was also, and, Herb Trimpe was drawing it at that time. John Severin was inking it, and I think that's just great, great comics. But there have been a lot of good runs since then. There was a great run. There was a great run with Sal Buscema drawing it, and there were various writers. The writers on Hulk seemed to rotate a little bit faster than they did on some other books, so there were a lot of guys writing it. But
sure,
that was a great long run. The Peter David era was not my favorite. Mostly because he had a couple of artists I wasn't really into. Todd McFarlane.
Yeah.
That was one of his first regular jobs in comics.
Yeah.
And I was never a fan. And then right after Todd McFarlane, they had another guy whose name escapes me right now.
He's a local guy. It's Dale Keown.
No, Dale was after. Dale came later. So I actually got out of the Hulk for a while.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, after McFarlane, there was a guy in the late 80s. I can't remember who, but it was when the Great Hulk was in Vegas.
That's absolutely correct. That's right.
Yeah, and I can't remember who did that, but he wasn't a particularly appealing artist to me. I did like the Byrne run before McFarlane.
That's a good run. I have all of those. Byrne sort of had this kind of thing of like, I'm going to shake it up, right?
Yeah.
I didn't like every choice that he made, storytelling-wise, like with the Hulk, but...
I'm not a Byrne fan now, but back in the day, that was one of my favorites of his, because it wasn't as ambitious, but there was, I don't know, just something pleasurable about the storytelling.
Well, some great pages in there. He was
doing
that too, some really cool stuff. So I really got back into the Hulk when Dale Keown started drawing it.
Are you and Dale friends?
No. I've met Dale, but I wouldn't say we're friends. No.
Okay.
Yeah, he's friends with Richard Pace.
I don't know who that is. Sorry.
Richard Pace. He's another local Toronto comic book artist.
Okay.
Yeah, you know him. You may just the name you don't recognize him, but
right.
Richard Pace. Anyway, he's a really talented local artist, and he and Dale are quite close. So I've met him a few times at conventions. Said hi, shaken hands, but
sure.
I've never gotten to know Dale particularly.
So before we wrap up, I should ask: is there anything you want listeners to know about stuff you're working on, or stuff to look out for from you?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, since I got back in, I was out of the animation business for a while, doing storyboards for live action film and TV, and I did that for a long time, about 13, 14 years, and I was completely out of animation during that time. But that work has sort of dried up. Storyboarding for live action isn't really a thing anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm back in the animation business. So it's sort of a full-time job. It's a 45, 50 hours a week of work. So I really haven't had much time to do any more stuff. But what I'm hoping to do before I get too old to do it is to do a graphic novel. So
awesome.
I have 2 graphic novel ideas, and actually, my thought is that I'm going to write both of them, but I'm only going to draw one of them.
Gotcha.
And I'm going to find an artist to do the other one.
And do you want to keep the ideas under wraps for now?
Yeah, I think I'll keep them to myself until I get. But as I start developing them, I'll be posting some stuff on Facebook, so you can follow it there. And
awesome.
if I get to a place where I've got something going, I'd be happy to do another interview and talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. Let me know.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thanks a lot for having me on. I hope I wasn't too verbose.
No, you're perfect, and it was a pleasure to talk to you.
We didn't really cover the rest of my comics career, so we'll have to catch that another time.
Your multifaceted career, all those interests.
Yes, my post Looney Tunes comics career, which is much less interesting, I think. But anyway, it's probably worth covering at some point.
Cool. Okay, thanks, Sam.
Tell us what you think. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We have a pretty active Facebook group, so please sign up for some interesting comics discussion. You can support this show by pledging at patreon.com/deconcomics. Pledging $2 a month allows you to get show outtakes and occasional other photos and videos. Then at $4 a month, you can get all that, plus you can hear full-length content such as our ongoing series Spider-Man 1963, a bi-weekly issue-by-issue look at the first year of everyone's favorite wall crawler. Your Patreon support gets you bonus content while supporting the making of our free content. Show your support by backing us for $4 a month or more at patreon.com/deconcomics. By the way, if you've pledged to us on Patreon at the $1, $3, or $5 tier, don't forget to update your pledge to the new tiers so you can still access bonus content. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. We'd really appreciate it if you gave us a star rating there and a short review. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Mulele and I will be here next week to talk about 2 more comics submitted by their creators. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.